Good morning. Thank you all for coming today. And it's wonderful to see so many people from international communities. Now, this presentation is a compilation of a variety of projects that I have undertaken that have produced publications, notably my book, Behind Closed Doors. These projects, which start in the 19th century and continue through to today, include the work of the first social workers in family assessments, early child protection legislation, the role of the state and other charitable organisations, such as child rescuers and the lived experience of children in care. This presentation is based on one of the major findings from this research, the uncomfortable truth. Why are children in care still stigmatised? I'm currently researching into other historical aspects to add to this research. In the first half of the 19th century, the British establishment, fearing the evolution of movements like the French Revolution, reinforced the need for social regulation, leading to the introduction of criminal legislation allowing the state to remove children. Options for parents in dire straits were limited to applications to charitable childcare organisations or the Poor Law. They were treated as improvident, regardless of their circumstances and without considering the impact of poverty. Regular employment was considered preferable to voluntarily relinquishing a child to care in charitable institutions. Lone mothers were particularly targeted in efforts to prevent daughters being contaminated or repeating their mother's behaviour. When arrangements broke down for poor families, the authorities had the power to commit children to care until they were 16 years of age and remove parental rights. Several industrial schools acts were introduced from 1857 onwards, each giving increased power to the state. Young children were charged and appeared in court, usually without any legal representation, likewise for their parents. Children were removed from their families criminalized and incarcerated in regimented industrial schools with little or no contact with their parents. My research has focused on a charitable organisation, the Waifs and Stray Society, now the Children's Society, who provided accommodation for children in voluntary care and those committed to care under the Industrial Schools Act. I have read 6,824 files of children in the care of the Waifs and Stray Society, now will be known as the WSS, and I have created a data set of the children committed to the WSS industrial schools between 1833 and 1899. This presentation uses correspondence from the case notes from the children, parents, employers, the WSS, staff, and the state to show the influences and attitudes of the time towards children in care, alongside documentary sources from state and charitable or institutions. Serious case reviews, inquiries, and social media have enabled me to make some comparisons between the centuries to look at how the stigma of care has evolved and remained. Stigma is said to have originated from the Poor Law and Victorian philanthropists who wanted to rescue children from what they considered irresponsible parents. The history of the stigma of children in care and its relevance today is underexplored. Stigma is an attitude or belief, and discrimination is the outcome by others holding those beliefs and attitudes. However, being disadvantaged can lead to social exclusion, limit life chances, and subsequently stigmatization. For my research on the experiences of children in care in the 19th century, I suggest there are three types of stigma particularly pertinent to these children then and today. Firstly, structural stigma, which relates to institutional policies based on stigmatizing attitudes. Secondly, public stigma, which reflects the predominant opinions society has about people with certain characteristics. And negative stereotypes of such people or groups are often portrayed in the media with limited information, which can influence adverse public perceptions. And thirdly, associative stigma, which focuses on people with connections to someone with a characteristic regarded as unfavourable. In this instance, it is related to society's views of parents inherited by the child. For some parents in desperate situations, the only option other than the stigmatising workhouse was requesting admission of their child to a childcare organisation like the WSS. The newly established charity organisation, hereafter the COS, who had shared aims with the government and the harsh New Poor Law, was responsible for charitable administration. The COS accredited as being the first social workers and were encouraged to participate in health and welfare organisations to influence policy and practice, and they had influential members on the WSS committees. The policy of the COS was to ascertain the causes of poverty and ill health before giving help. Middle-class philanthropists with little understanding of working-class life attributed their values to their own experience and expectations of childhood and family life. Institutions considered parents unable to work or look after their children and stigmatized them as failing parents. Most of the cases for committal proceedings were instigated by statutory organisations such as the Education Department. The main reason for committal were the children were in moral danger. More girls were committed for this reason than boys, and neglect, as you can see in this slide. There was often an overlap in reasons for most referrals. The press were allowed to report the cases and publish the children's details, and members of the public were able to attend the hearing. Language used by the courts, officials, WSS staff, media, employers, and parents, such as the defendant, charged with, in the dock, on licence, sentence, and custody, reinforced the child's culpability during their period of committal and beyond. Parents were demonised by the authorities and accused of ruining their children's progress. And this is evident in these quotes from the authorities. Children were blamed and punished and stigmatized for their parents' behavior by virtue of their committal. Rescued children were seen as both victim and threat because they came from immoral backgrounds, and this was exemplified by narratives from child rescuers or of derogatory descriptions of the children with racial undertones, such as street Arabs or English Kafirs, or even described as human vermin or savages. Influential people condoned and perpetuated these attitudes, including a pamphlet with a derogatory title, Child of the English Savage, which was written jointly by Benjamin Moore, who was the NSPCC founder, and the Cardinal Archbishop of Westminster. And the quote from the magazine Night and Day is from Dr. Bernardo, who was writing in the organisation's magazine. Meanwhile, children in care were trained for low-paid employment with little opportunity for social mobility. They were usually placed as domestic servants, in private homes who were contacts of the WSS. The following extracts from committed children's letters identified some of the hurtful stigmatization experienced after the children had left the WSS accommodation and moved into the adult world of employment as a servant. And they give a glimpse into how children are expected to behave and were sometimes threatened by their employers. These letters are reproduced as they were written by the writers. George and Francis are explaining the abusive, exploitive situations they are living in. In Francis's case, she's overruled by a former employer, disbelieved and labelled. There are many examples of such experiences where the employers or members of staff describe negative behaviour, intellectual abilities, and physical condition of older children by the staff. As you can see from that of Elsie's circumstances, her disabilities were highlighted and seen as an impairment. And you can see this also from Ethel and Jane. And Jane was committed when she was 11 and she was beyond the parental control. And the staff consider her a bad lot, eligible for penitentiary. But they cast aspersions on the girls' characters, and they also had the power to determine the rest of their lives, as evident in the workhouse admission for Ethel and the threat of a penitentiary for Jane. Both were unhappy, but solutions were based on a pragmatic basis, the smooth running of the institution and financial concerns. Emigrating children was a popular solution to remove children from the care of the state. It relieved the authorities of the financial burden and the responsibilities of childcare. Besides, the official state view considered the benefits of emigration, particularly for committed children, was the need to get away from their families' influences. Children were screened for emigration. Only the fittest and healthiest were accepted. The WSS considered that moving away from the family was a good way to start afresh and forget the past. Miss Rye, who was the emigration coordinator, made a statement about this child, and it is an example of derogatory language used by those working directly with children. Being in care leads to a loss of identity and what Goffman refers to as a spoiled identity, which affects self-esteem amongst other symptoms, including anxiety and depression. The following examples address some practical problems faced by former residents and exemplify the impact generated by both the practical lack of identity and the authorities' attitude in response to help. Children brought up in care could become invisible without their legal identity. Kate wrote to the WSS in 1927 requesting her birth certificate and asked to provide details which she could not give. Her letters show how being removed from her family had impacted her. And I'll just read the beginning. Can you tell me if ever I had a sister named Alice, which I think I had, because I can remember my mother telling me in her letters, and you can read the rest of that. The WSS advised after exhaustive, unsuccessful searches, they couldn't help. In 1935, aged 59, Kate inquired again and had to repeat the same details. Eventually, in 1938, Kate was advised to use her warrant as a proof of age for her pension, even though she shared this with another girl who was not a relative. It was embarrassing and humiliating for her to use a warrant, a reminder of her criminalisation for identification. Kate questions whether she was responsible for being removed from her family, and she also expresses feelings of the loss of her identity, sadness, and hopelessness. John's initial inquiries to the NSPCC into his background when he was 22 were unsatisfactory. The NSPCC wrote that a considerable amount of time had been spent investigating his background, but it was impossible to do any more. John wrote to the WSS in 1942, aged 58, requesting his birth certificate. Eventually, he received a copy and an explanation why things had taken so long. His mother had used his father's name but registered John under her name and received an apology from the WSS for never informing him of his correct surname. And girls were also reported being known by a different name because there was already someone in the same name in the home. Beth was committed age 7 as she was living with prostitutes. She was emigrated to Canada in 1907. Following unsuccessful requests to the WSS in 1928 and 1950 for her birth certificate, in 1952, her psychiatric social worker in Canada requested more details about Beth. She explained the effect Beth's early life had had on her throughout her adult life. And I think that it's fair to say that the agencies did not understand the need to have identification, and there were big gaps in these children's lives that continued into adulthood. So if we fast forward to the inception of the welfare state in 1948, which marked the end of the New Poor Law. During this transition and beyond, some former staff who remained in post as practitioners or administrators and continued with the same attitudes associated with the deserving and undeserving poor, which had dominated welfare provision for over 120 years. By the late 1960s and 1970s, changing attitudes and practice were starting to emerge. But following budget cuts in the mid-1970s, restrictions were made in public sector services, including housing, education, and welfare. In the 1980s, gaps between rich and poor widened and public services were cut under the politics of the Thatcher government, promoting a more individualistic and less compassionate society. This was reflected in the attitudes towards lone parents, reminiscent of those in the 19th century towards illegitimacy, and resurrecting notions of the deserving and undeserving. One such group who have been historically stigmatized are lone mothers of illegitimate children, as they were often refused assistance. Lone mothers were deemed irresponsible if they could not maintain themselves. Legislation discriminated against children born out of marriage, giving them fewer legal rights than those born to married parents. In practice, many illegitimate children were accommodated under the Poor Law. Besides, illegitimacy reflected a mother's morals, which reflected those of the many Victorian philanthropists. But this attitude continued. These quotes show a pattern. In the 1980s, Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher suggested that young women were getting pregnant to jump the housing queue. This perception was eagerly promoted in the right-wing media of the time, encouraging the view that lone mothers were simply persons of bad character. And in 1995, the future Conservative Prime Minister Boris Johnson wrote in The Spectator, single mothers were raising a generation of ill-raised, ignorant, aggressive, and illegitimate children. So where are we today? Numerous examples of the problems arising from the stigmatization of children in care reveal the impact of their identity, self-esteem, and well-being in two different time frames and are remarkably similar. Knowing a young person had been in care led them to be labelled as a troublemaker, as was the case for a young lad in a job interview. The interviewer asked the applicant, What did you do to get yourself put in care? When a young care experienced woman discussed her work conditions and social work with a trade union rep, she was advised that the management would think she could not be objective as she had been in care. Children who were committed to care were automatically associated with their parents' behaviour, and concerted attempts by the authorities to move children far away from them to restrict their influence reinforced this. Systemic failure in public service leads to associative stigma. Other associated factors arising from children's backgrounds continue the characterization of care leavers, such as the questioning of parenting capabilities. Serious case reviews in the 21st century unpick the failings of local authorities. Some children aged 13 years who were involved in the sexual exploitation cases were described as making lifestyle choices to become prostitutes and drug addicts. Their conclusions highlight incompetent and uncaring political and professional leadership, as well as a desire to restrict funding for looked after children. Children in care and care leavers are dependent on social care managers for their upbringing, the corporate parent, which is now dependent on reduced budgets and protocol. In practice, an unequal system created by policy leads to further disadvantage and public stigmatization. For example, one of the frontline scandals about children in care concerns placements in unregulated, independent or semi-independent living accommodation for some children under the age of 16. Children placed in these properties have described the difficulties of having to reside with drug dealers, trying to study, financial problems, fear, and other aspects of being alone while trying to negotiate independent living without support. The advocacy organisation, Article 39, regularly brings these issues to public attention, yet the responsible authorities, the corporate parent, have sanctioned this arrangement. To return to the question, what is this uncomfortable truth? Has there been a change for children in care? Indeed, there have undoubtedly been some important changes which have benefited children in care since the 19th century, but the fact remains that the stigma of being in care still exists in attitudes. It is perhaps unsurprising that attitudes towards children in care are remarkably similar over the centuries, when since the onset of 19th century childcare legislation, children were criminalised rather than protected. Thank you.